Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to the Canadian Journalism Foundation's J Talks Live webcast series. I'm Anna Maria Tremonti, host of this virtual series. It was launched during COVID, and we're going to have another whole series starting now. This J Talks speaker series explores pressing media issues. This season, our theme is the evolution of journalism. And today, we'll talk about the newsroom challenges faced by Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and the biases in media coverage. A conversation resurrected in the aftermath of the police killing in the US of George Floyd, which has ignited a reckoning across every facet of our society. Thanks to those of you who sent questions in advance, some of which we'll cover in our discussion. And as you know, you can continue to send some questions in. And before we get started, the CJF would like to thank the generosity of the J Talks series sponsor, BMO Financial Group, as well as in-kind supporters CPAC and Cision. And a few helpful notes about this podcast as we begin. If your internet quality is poor, you can click on the click here to switch stream button to view at a lower bandwidth. The video quality will decrease, but the audio quality will stay strong. Now, if you're having technical issues that you can't deal with, click on the request help button or bubble on the bottom right corner of the webcast page, and your request will be emailed back to the email address that you provided. We are extending this webcast beyond the usual 40 minutes to allow for more discussion and more audience questions around these important issues. I'll chat with our guests first before I may incorporate some of your questions in. Some of you are already channeling the questions I was going to ask, so we'll try to get as much of that in as possible, but submit your questions at any time using the questions tab. And of course, if you want to tweet about this, the hashtag is JTalksLive. So joining me today is Duncan, host of CBC Radio 1's podcast playlist, and also Ontario Weekend's morning show, Fresh Air. Nanaba is currently on leave. She is a William Southam Journalism Fellow at the University of Toronto's Massey College, where she is studying the experiences of racialized and women leaders in Canadian media. Karen K. Ho is a global finance and economics reporter for the New York-based Quartz, a digital business news publication. And Angela Sterritt is a journalist with CBC Vancouver and a member of the Gitxsan Nation. She is also an adjunct professor at UBC's School of Journalism. Hello and welcome to the three of you. Thank you for joining us for this discussion today.
Thanks for having us. Hi.
Thrilled to be here.
This is a really important and necessary moment in time to examine and change what has sort of become the status quo in journalism, and to rethink. What I want to talk to you about today is how we rethink what we cover, how we define news, how we assign news, the sources we consult, the rigor we follow, and maybe confront what we have or what so many have ignored or glossed over or did not consider or did not even see, that you have been seeing and you couldn't get others to see. And I want to, have this conversation both for what's going on inside newsrooms and also what's going on in the field in coverage. So let's start maybe briefly with each of you telling us, first of all, how you are processing both journalistically and personally, how you're processing the incidents, the events, and the discussions of the last several months. And maybe, Angela, let's start with you on that.
Sure. Amasa, good day. I just want to first of all acknowledge the unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh that I am on today. And yeah, it's been a really long journey. I feel like to get to where we're even having a conversation about the media's the problems within our newsrooms, within the way that we tell stories, within the way that we reflect on the stories, within the way that we understand bias from somewhat of a colonial perspective. I feel like what happened is in May, after George Floyd's death, horrific death, and so many that followed of Indigenous and people of color, Black people in Canada, that we were having this really strong, rigorous discussion in our newsrooms. And it was sort of like this reckoning and this moment of, hey, now it's time to look inward. And now it is time to navel gaze. Now it is time to say, what are we doing wrong here? And how can we change it? And let's start listening to those voices. But I've been talking to people about this recently, and I feel like that was almost then. That was May, June, and July. And now we're sort of back to normalcy. And so keeping that conversation going has been challenging. It's been a long road in terms of how our leadership responds to stories, how other journalists respond to criticism, and how we recognize and how we do a better job by addressing that where we are today, that we haven't done a good job. We haven't, our coverage has often been laden with excuses of why we don't do stories, or why we've done them in the ways that we have from the certain perspectives. So it's been a really long journey for myself as an Indigenous Giksan woman to get to the place where we are now, just to have these conversations and to feel like I have allies in the newsroom. And that's incredible, to have people who I can say, can you respond to that email, or can you take this on? Because it's hard as, you know, as the lone in First Nations voice, you know, often in the newsroom, to constantly be taking this on, it's exhausting. And you get to the point where, you know, we're looking at different things going on across Canada, and you just can't be the person who's taking all the, how do you pronounce this name? What's the context here? Can you tell me about the historical viewpoint of that? And it gets tough. And so we're here, and we have a long ways to go. But I'm grateful for the people who are listening and who have taken that step up to say, you know, you don't have to do all the work. We can listen, but we can also advocate for your being, your presence, and for Indigenous stories to be told in the rigorous, the investigative, the accurate, the sensitive way that all other stories are told.
You're both nodding, Karen and Nanaba. So Nanaba, why don't you go next on how you've been processing this time?
Badly, to be honest with you. George Floyd died, and then it was everywhere in the news, and then I had to do a show called Fresh Air for the weekend morning, and I had to make a concerted effort to decide how I was going to respond to the moment, because inwardly I was responding with tears and lack of sleep. And so I had to go on a Saturday morning, and I remember thinking, what am I doing? Because I didn't feel like I was talking to my community. I didn't feel like I was doing what I should, like representing my community somehow. And so the way that I thought about it on a Saturday was, okay, I have this job because I have this energy, and my energy for this show is light, and I can be a breath of fresh air. So that's what I'll do today. That's what I'll do in this moment. And so I was able to do that. And then the feelings got heavier. And the way that I thought that I could address it was by talking to Black people who are listening, but also to everyone else. And the way that I did that was I basically just came up with a message, something that would tell people something is happening here. You think it's going on in the States, but we are feeling it. We're feeling it. And so the only way that I could talk about that was to say, you know, that a community is in pain when we're checking in on each other. So the way that I was processing was other Black people, other Black journalists, I would just like text them or message them the Black fist and a heart. And they did the same thing back. There was no, what's this for? We all knew. Everyone knew. Do you know what I'm saying? So beyond the tears, I processed it by engaging in the conversations that I was asked to engage in. So when the president of CBC wanted to speak to a number of Black employees, and I was asked, likely because I was the co-chair of Diversify, our employee resource group for people of color, I came to the meeting. And I'll talk more about what happened, but I'll let Karen talk now, but ultimately it's been hard. And then the news about yesterday, I don't know how I'm supposed to stay out of it. And I don't think that I'm a bad journalist for having these feelings. But I have felt like I'm a bad journalist for having these feelings.
We're going to talk about that after. I want to talk more about that, but yes, go ahead, Karen.
I think it's especially challenging because the things that make this particular panel really vigilant and comprehensive about our work also makes us vulnerable to being overwhelmed right now, because we are hyper aware in our diligence, in our understanding, in our deep level of empathy, our ability to understand the perspectives both of our communities and what are the gaps in reporting, and see like we are extra vulnerable to levels of trauma in not only the extent in which we understand the scope of the problem for each of our communities, like not only it feels like even like a multi-level version of what was happening the first months after the Me Too stories in the fall of 2017, when it felt like every day there was a new update that was just overwhelming and filled with really, really graphic detail, to the extent that everyone had suspected that there was a serious problem, but the layers in which people had been enabled to be really horrific. And so the thing that is difficult is the three of us come from very specific backgrounds and experiences, but our ability to empathize with what it is like, especially to be a woman who has been underestimated or undervalued throughout much of your career, and how that's reflected in our work. On top of that, it's, I think, the real understanding based on our careers as journalists about the people that we're reporting on and how their experiences can be our own or have been our own. So right now, just like what Nana was saying, like I have a very hyper real understanding of the likelihood that I will experience anti-Chinese or anti-Asian racism in Canada and in the United States. Like that is a reality of as soon as I step outside of where I live. And that is traumatic to mentally prepare and try to compartmentalize while doing the work that highlights things like, I cover finance and economics, so I have a real numerical understanding regarding things like graduation rates from universities, or, you know, how often promotions are denied, or, you know, the employment and earnings gaps, you know, like I understand on a very statistical basis how things are stacked against us. And I then have to compartmentalize it to be normal, productive at my job, even when all of these things are going on. And that is very, very, it's like we are burdened with extra sacks of potatoes when everyone else is running up the hill. And I think that's like having to explain that additional challenge in the way that the real cost, not only in terms of things like there are real costs in terms of all of us, the unpaid work that we do to connect to other people, to, you know, mentor other people coming up behind us, to connect to our peers who are going through the same challenges, or also explaining to people who don't have these experiences and understand the additional unpaid challenges of doing so, like like how much I spend on therapy every year, or, you know, like anti-anxiety medications, or even things like personal safety. You know, starting in March, early March, before even the pandemic was declared, I had a cold and I stopped going out because I knew that if I coughed or sneezed on the subway, it would be interpreted very differently, especially with my historical understanding of SARS in Canada and the United States. And what I had already reported on about the pandemic in places like Chinatown in New York City or in Canada. And so that, you know, that has professional repercussions, it has personal repercussions. But journalism is constantly told, you know, this is a deadline, serious business, it's unrelenting, you know, like your credit card bills and your rent don't care about your intersectional identity. And so the challenge is, it quite honestly, it's incredibly lonely, especially during a pandemic when we're not allowed to gather and mourn, especially if we knew people who had suffered or died from COVID-19 or had suffered repercussions of racism and persistent systemic discrimination. You know, we can't even gather to just talk to each other and hug each other and say that you're not alone. And that is really something that makes it extra difficult right now. And so there's a lot of group texting. Group texting right now is very, very important, especially for journalists of color, but there is something still, and also the places that we would normally gather at, say, like employment resource groups or journalism conferences specifically for Indigenous or Black or Asian or Hispanic journalists have been taken away. You know, those spaces, what a sociologist named Elijah Anderson defines as like a non-white space, you know, that physical psychological safety and that feeling is, you know, once a year you gather and you really are reaffirmed in why you're doing this work and why it's important. So the challenge is explaining that additional burden, and that it's important that that it has real physical and you know, impacts and productivity impacts, and that doesn't make us bad journalists. It means that we are human beings who are responding in a reasonable way to our real understanding and our firsthand understanding of what's going on. Because
I'm going to jump in there because you're just it's the bad journalist thing. I want to explore that with the three of you because I don't think that makes you a bad journalist at all. I think it makes you a better journalist to recognize, because to recognize your own feelings and the feelings in the community that is your community, and to bring that to the table to a newsroom. That doesn't make you a bad journalist. And we have to talk about why anyone would think that would. And that gets into these questions of so-called objectivity versus just shutting things down. So,
yes,
and you know, one of our
absolutely.
questions, I'll tell you right now that somebody wrote that in. It was Joyce Matthews said, should a journalist include the journalist's personal opinion in a news story? But I think thank you for that question, Joyce. But I think as well that, you know, it's got to do with who you are as a journalist, and what you bring to the table makes you a better journalist. So talk to me a little bit about, obviously this needs to change if you are, and Angela, I don't know if you feel the same way, but if you think somehow this makes you a bad journalist to have feelings, no, it does not.
I mean, I agree with you, but I was just being honest about the feelings. And I think it's because when I first got to CBC, my goal was to just get on a show, man. So I was pitching everywhere. I was doing what I needed to do. But the doing what you need to do really meant to emulate, for me at the time, was to emulate what I saw, right? And to emulate what I saw means to do it how everyone else is doing it. Never said, at no point did anyone say, bring your perspective. What's happening in the Ghanaian community? What's happening in different Black communities? No, it was never that. So I guess what I'm saying is that I learned that there was sort of a lack of invitation of these other parts of myself. And I mean, if you want to call that the Kool-Aid, I was drinking it every day, you know? And I think part of the feelings that I've had lately is anger because I've realized, oh my God, I just didn't bring my whole self for so long. That's kind of sad. And I can tell that I didn't because I see other journalists who are doing it. And I'm like, I never would have done that because I would have thought that that wouldn't have been accepted. And maybe I'm wrong, but that was what I thought. And so when it comes to, and I think that I've had moments where I tried to bring myself, maybe in pitching, and there are so many different ways that an idea is sort of shot down. And so it screws with your mind. It makes you wonder whether your way of thinking is wrong. So perhaps that's where a person could get the idea that they're not a good journalist. But I agree, it doesn't mean that you are. It doesn't mean that you're a bad journalist.
Angela, you're about to say something.
Yeah, just on the note about the idea of impartiality, when you have a nation of Canada that was founded upon colonization, it was founded upon racial violence against yourself. And that's the baseline for our impartiality, as I was saying before. This is our norm. You know, we don't sign off. Angela Sterritt, CBC News, unceded territories of the Musqueam, right? It's Vancouver. And we don't question colonization. There's reports and reports and reports that I've looked at where media outlets actually encourage the taking of Indigenous children, or for many, many years, we didn't say survivors. We weren't allowed to say the term survivors when it came to residential school. We had to say students. The way that we've framed our reporting and our worldview as journalists is from the base of neutrality is colonization. So coming out and saying, I believe in decolonization, now I'm an activist. Now I'm an advocate. Now I'm not a journalist. I've crossed the line and I'm seen as one of those people. And I can't tell you how many times I've faced that in my career by other journalists, complaints. And I don't know how other people feel, but as an Indigenous journalist, you're constantly fielding complaints from the public, from other journalists, mainly those, the journalists and from the public, about you being non-biased, about you putting your view in there because it's considered radical. I mean, even saying this is racist is considered radical. Even saying Black Lives Matter is radical, which is, it's unbelievably fraught and problematic. And so I also hear like a lot of like what I consider dog whistle racism, like, oh, Angela, you're so passionate. And that's what you bring to the table is your passion and your care and your emotion. Never like, wow, you did all those FOIs on that story. You're an excellent investigative journalist. So you hear those kinds of views, you see them, and it's just like like Ninaba was saying, you're constantly like feeling like you're okay, like I have to be a white person in this reality, and in my story pitches, I have to white code this. I have to come across everything that you do has to be somewhat from a colonial mind frame or mindset, because if you don't, you're an advocate or you're an activist. And so it's this constant navigating of how people are going to see you, how people are going to see the stories. And like I said, like I feel we were in this reckoning moment, like, okay, let's use the words anti-racism or racism. Let's call it what it is. It's okay to say Black Lives Matter on Twitter, all this stuff. But I feel like now it's like, okay, we're in September, we're relaunching our regular, our normalcy, and it's hard. And I knew this was going to happen when I saw that happening, all the letters coming out from all these corporations all across Canada. I knew like this is a letter and this is going to go on for a couple months and now we're back. And how do you it's exhausting. It's exhausting to constantly be like, I'm here, I'm at the table, I have a perspective that will actually help you, will like let you in and see what this world is about. But also like explaining, like, this is, you know, with the Mi'kmaq fishery, explaining the way that we're doing things is, again, like fraught. And it's, I think, Karen, you were saying, it's like going up a hill with a huge sack of potatoes on all the time, and you're constantly like getting chipped away at, and it's hard. It's like where, and for me, I do think the way that things have changed is in that time of reckoning, you had people saying, you know, I'm actually going to be an ally and I will fight this battle for you. And we need that. We need people to say, I'm going to pick up this incredible anti-Black racism story, not incredible in that it's horrific, but we're going to take that on and we're going to showcase why this is important, why we believe this is a story to tell, rather than, oh yeah, I don't even think that's racism. So yeah, there's small changes, but again, like where we're at right now in terms of what is impartiality, what is balance, what is neutrality, that needs to change. And that's going to come with more of our voices.
You know, I'm really struck by that, because that is that argument when somebody says you're biased. It's not that you're biased. You have a deeper understanding of an issue and its context. So you see the story that others aren't seeing. And so when you bring it up, that's not a bias, that's a more educated view of what's going on around you. And more people need to listen to that. Karen, I know you want to jump in, go ahead.
So you were leading up to it, and the word that I wanted to even use instead of educated is it's an expertise. It needs to be recognized as an expertise. The three of us have a firsthand understanding of the impact of colonialism and racism and discrimination, both on ourselves and our communities, and the history of that and how it accumulates, both in terms of trauma and economic the lack of economic opportunities and our ability to participate in society in the same way that a lot of white people have been allowed to through the accumulation of wealth and roles of power and political influence. That's the real fundamental thing. What is recognized as bias and what is recognized as expertise, and how those goalposts are constantly moved for people who are, quite frankly, on this panel. I'm always asking people to think about that in terms of how they define it, because once you interrogate it, they realize that it's an immutable thing and it changes constantly.
Karen, I really like that framing. I like that framing of expertise, because I think that for many people, they would come to us for expertise, for me anyway, when it has to do with hip hop or, you know, anything that might be seen as Black culturally. Yeah. Somehow, but when it comes to, I guess, more serious matters, then the expertise may not be, it may not be seen as expertise.
But that's the thing is, like, I am constantly interrogating things that are considered white and mainstream and how they're considered expertise and not bias. Like in the United States, when the Boston bombings happened and all these journalists were talking about like the schools that they went to in the Boston area or their understandings of the demographics, I was like, oh, why is that considered an expertise and not the fact that you grew up in an affluent area of this like prominent metropolitan city in the United States? Like, I'm always asking people that. Or, you know, I had brought this up in terms of my expertise just about Asian culture and not about like what you were talking about, like the languages that I learned to speak, or my understanding regarding immigration, or even in terms of things like food and slang, was only recognized as expertise because I wrote about a movie that featured Asian people. But it was a competitive advantage and finally recognized as expertise because the people that I was competing with who didn't have that perspective, it wasn't a bias. It meant that when I was talking to the cast and crew of this very particular and world famous film, it meant that I could ask them questions after they had done several years of interviews and press junkets that finally, literally days before the movie came out, no one had asked them that. And then it was finally recognized as expertise And it was important that also my editors recognized its expertise because it offered them exclusive details that no one else could get. The difference about that is what we know from economics is that it's not often enough recognized with economic incentives. Like, I'm sure the people on this panel have a much clearer understanding of the diversity regarding who we're sourcing on a day-to-day basis than a lot of people have ever thought. Like, I have a running tally of how many times I have interviewed a woman of color or a person of color, especially for my econ and finance stories. That's important to me, but that's something I've done over several years. That is an expertise for me to think about the questions that I can ask them and the markets that they are probably thinking about from their own background and the backgrounds of who they're considering. But that isn't given an economic incentive in terms of like performance reviews or promotions. And it's not disincentivized. Like, if someone in finance or econ reporting only interviews middle-aged white people, same thing with politics, same thing with music, that isn't economically disincentivized. And so we just keep rewarding it over and over again. And when we talk about changes, like, we really need to talk about like, what are the things that people will move people to do these changes, including paying them or promoting them more based on their behaviors, the things that the three of us do intuitively that we know benefit and better reflect our communities and the work that we want to do, but they're not seen as worth being recognized, both in terms of, like press releases and also in terms of our promotions and how much we get paid. So I think that's like a real thing that I think about all the time, is just asking over and over again, what is considered bias versus expertise when we talk about journalism? And even the conversations right now, even regarding like the three of us, who are we allowed to be friends with and considered biased or activist? Because the thing is, like, right now we're finding out in the United States that a prominent NPR reporter had a multi-decade friendship with a Supreme Court justice. And that was not seen as bias. That was seen as aiding in her expertise about covering a very complicated political situation. But if the three of us were in any way close friends over that long of a period with someone who was advocating for economic inequality, like better economic equality for our specific racial groups, we would be seen as biased.
That's right. You would be called, oh, you're using the same person all the time and it's a bias. I just want to jump in, Karen, and make the point as well. When you do that, when you source the people you're talking about, then it shows up in your reporting, it shows up on air, it allows people in the audience to see people like themselves talking about these issues, that it broadens the issue. I mean, it makes news coverage what it's supposed to be. It covers a larger community. It is a good thing to be doing that, right? And it's it's interesting to me that you feel like you have to be like a groundbreaker to do that, when in fact that should be what every newsroom says, are we doing this? That should be an
but you know what, we
chat.
should say that there are some newsrooms.
Yes, there are some,
and I know, Karen,
and there's some shows. Yes.
And I just want to say that I know that for my show, I was so grateful to end up with a producer who truly cared about that kind of stuff. She brought stories to me that I just did not get from the previous producer, and that one thing, when I think, I can't remember what it was, but when my producer came to me with an idea about Black women and mental health, I was just like, I don't know if I said this to her, but I was really like, oh my God, like, this is great. Like, she gets me. And she's been like that for a long time, but I didn't know her. And so it felt new to me. Do you know what I mean? And that's not cool that it felt new to me, Yeah.
So
she also felt safe.
This touches on another issue, and that is like, who is source. Now, in the conversation of the last several months, there have been many calls to rethink how we quote and believe police and authority sources, specifically in issues around, the deaths of of Black, Indigenous, people of color in police custody and that kind of thing. But you can take it further in terms of the sources we use, the studies we look at. An example just recently, Paul Krugman in the New York Times was talking about got excoriated over Twitter because he said that 9/11 wasn't so bad, it would have been worse under Trump. And then he doubled down with FBI statistics on hate crimes, and right away other people jumped on and said, well, hang on, they're FBI statistics. You think this is not reflective of what people of color have been experiencing through 9/11 and Muslim people and others. And so how do we take this rigor and take it further? Because that is also part of the status quo, whose statistics you use, who you go to, who is believed without enough questions of why are you saying that? Who told you that? Did you see that?
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting question today. And we've had in our newsroom, like so many JSP questions around that. Like whose last call is it, right? So we can't do a story unless we have, and now I'm speaking widely about all news outlets, but you get a press release, say, from an Indigenous community about police violence or something against an Indigenous teenager. Well, you have to get the police's comment on that, or it's not a story. So who's making the story, right? And so that's been troublesome when you have an institution that's been, or a number of institutions that have been racially racist and violent against BIPOC people, and that's your line. You must have this institution's perspective or it didn't happen, right? You must have this white person's perspective. So a story that I recently did, you need to have, it wasn't said to me like this, but in my head, because of, what I've gone through, it was like, okay, I need to have these like 5 white witnesses who saw this racism, so it can be called racism, so it can stand up to the scrutiny of the public or the other journalists. And I feel like that's problematic when you have an institution, say, when we were talking about the defund the police movement, and the police, if you don't have that comment from the police, then it's not a story. Oh, we just won't do it. And that's a problem.
Sorry.
Go on, sorry.
Well, I was just gonna say, Anna Maria, your question is about, it's a process question, right? Like how you're talking about extending the rigor. How do we extend that rigor to include these other perspectives? We have to go back. We have to go way back to how we are even learning to, we really have to go back to when we were all in school and start taking classes from people like us. You know what I mean? What we're talking about is an undoing. So if I'm to try and make this go forward, it goes back to the same question of all of us interrogating ourselves, interrogating what it is that we've been ingesting with media, interrogating what our first thoughts are when we see someone who looks different, and actively changing that, or trying to change how the different kinds of people that we follow on Twitter. It all comes back to what we are doing with ourselves. That's just one idea, though.
Well, I have a whole bunch of questions, and so I want to keep on going. Before I get to questions, though, I want to raise one other thing. The other day, in talking to you guys as we prepared for this, I used a word, and Nanaba, you called me on it, and you really made me think, and I felt bad, but I felt smarter. but I called this, I was talking about this is a time to really look and change, but I said this is an exciting time, and you called me on that word.
Yeah.
Tell our audience why.
Well, my experience in all of this is that in all of this call for change, the only people who say it's exciting are people who are not people of color. And I think it's it's a lot easier to look at the situation that way, because what you see is an opportunity for us to change. So it might seem exciting for us. I mean, the rest of us are just exhausted. We don't see it as exciting, really. We see it as like, well, damn, yeah, okay, yeah. Like, it's like when your rights are finally coming to you. And so I can say that it's certainly a time where we can start to look at being celebratory when things start to happen. But I just had to be honest with you in that moment. And it's not exciting. Like that, you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not,
I
like,
do.
Yay,
I do.
oh my God, we did that change. That's not what it's like, you know?
And I apologize for using
No,
I think I should. Like, you know, like I learned, you know.
Well, it's not really about you apologizing. It's about the fact that you are hearing it. And that's what I appreciate the most. It's that you're like, oh yeah, it's not exciting. This is like if, I don't even know how to describe it. You know, I just think of, if women started getting their rights, you know, it's not like it's an exciting for the women. They're not, you know what? I don't know. I wasn't there, but I think you understand what I'm saying.
I do. And I'm going to go to some questions. So this comes from Deanna Chang. What's a recent memorable moment that made you go, is this uphill battle worth it? And she's asking for a recent memorable moment that said yes, but you get to choose whether it's yes or not. Who wants to start?
I will say something. I will say that I've faced a lot of racism from the public, from other journalists, a lot. Like, these are serious things that are exhausting and where you're crying for days. And I've experienced a lot of racial violence. Sometimes really brutal. And it's been a lot of conversations, but it's been a lot of, I've had 2 producers who have listened, and they've actually listened. And you know that they've listened because they're not just saying, I get it, this is A, B, and C, and D, but they're doing something. So when they see anything, they go, I get that, I identify that, and I'm going to do something. And I was thinking before, like, oh, it sounds like I just say, I'm saying, you know, it's great that white people are speaking on our behalf now. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that it's such exhausting work, and it's like bullets in the chest, arrows in the back. And I'm saying arrows in the back for lateral violence and bullets in the chest for anti-Indigenous racism. And to have people who say, not only do I get it, but I'm going to bat for you when this happens. I'm not going to let you be on the receiving end of this anymore. And you see it, and they're doing it. And you're just like, you can breathe for a minute. You can go, okay, I can just do my story. Hey, I just get to be a journalist for today. You know, I'm not just combating racism all freaking day. I get to just do my job, you know, and that's a win. And that's sad, but that is a win for me. And that, I think, in a small part of this is that's what it's going to take, is for allies to say, we will address this for you and do our job as we should.
Karen, you're nodding. Go ahead.
It's one of those things that actually gives me hope, is like the work, because I think there's a feeling for a long time, to use another metaphor, that we have all felt like we have been drowning for a long time, and instead of being told, oh, you should get better at swimming, or we need to have a committee discussion about if we can give you a life raft, finally people are like, we're gonna like throw you the life raft and come out and rescue you and then help you recover once you get on land. And that is a very distinct distinction in this moment. And it's not like, it's very clear, because we've had these discussions for so many years, the people who have been in this industry, you can tell pretty quickly who is going to do the work, who is going to take on the emotional and professional burden and stick their necks out and put their careers, you know, to really say this is important and we cannot continue this ongoing pattern of our staff at many levels who are journalists of color to walk out. We can't just bring them in and then have them drown over and over again. And I think that is the real recognition that it is a collective responsibility, not just on the ERG again, like the employee resource group, to suggest the ways to change, like I think is the real thing that is distinctive and that I'm starting to notice. Because, and also, you know, not just unpaid consultation work from the three of us to figure out what to do next. Like really people saying, oh, okay, the resources or the articles and the instructions and solutions already exist. We just need to put them in place, sometimes at very little cost. So I think that's the thing. But I, like Angela was saying, I really, you know, I worry about, especially with the US election, which will, you know, take a lot of attention both sides of the border, what the momentum will be, and saying that this cannot be a lower priority because people are still trying to keep the lights on, or they need to redirect their attention and energy onto covering the issues of the day. Like, I really think that's important, because that has been the excuse that we've heard over and over again, is that, oh, we're too focused on like making sure that we can still afford to keep people on, or, you know, deal with funding issues or all this other stuff. And that excuse can't exist anymore, especially since the things that we care about a lot are never going away. Like what happened with Breonna Taylor yesterday just highlighted it for a lot of people. So I think that's the thing I'm really looking for right now is the planning and the real continual effort that is often really frustrating and exhausting, but taking that burden off of just people who look like us.
Nanaba.
The question is about a memorable moment, right?
Yeah.
I had a really intense moment with someone at work, and we were talking about racism, and we were talking about objectivity. And while it was hard, I really felt heard. I really felt heard. And I felt like I don't think it ends there. I think there truly are people, at least at my place of work at CBC, who are really, really trying, and leaders who are really trying. Another thing that has been memorable for me, so I'm at school here, I'm at Massey College, and I'm here to do some research on the experience of racialized leaders in Canadian media. And when what I have enjoyed is that people are interested in my work. They're interested in what I will find. And that says a lot to me.
And we didn't really even touch on this yet, but that the leadership has to reflect exactly what you're talking about as well. Mm-hmm. Does it not? I mean, we need to see, you know, the three of you, or if you choose that, you know, we need to see you in those positions of decision-making power, because it's how we assign and what we assign. And in the same way where you say that, you know, you're in a story meeting and no one hears your story, people need to be able to, people in those positions need to hear your story, like need to know.
They have to, and they have to feel safe. Ultimately, I think that if we have more leaders of color in Canadian media, I don't think that we would have that many situations where a Black reporter would have to hear the N-word in the meeting. Like, I just think that we would have an atmosphere that everyone would understand that that's completely unacceptable in any case. You know what I mean? But what I want to say more about leadership is that what I foresee is that we're going to have a whole, like a legion, potentially, if this is done right, of leaders in Canadian media who are people of color. And what I foresee is that if we don't do it right, there will be a problem. And the problem will be that maybe people won't listen to them, or they won't feel supported. I think that we have to do that right. That's kind of why I'm doing this work, is because I want to find out what is needed for these leaders. And on top of that, what if we are now going to see different kinds of leadership? What will that mean? So I also know that there may be some people considering like cluster hiring. If that happens, what happens to everyone else who may think that these people are only coming in because they're people, like that happens. And then you have the leader then thinking like, oh, am I only here for, like, there's a whole basket of issues to consider if we do that.
Can I just say, however, as somebody who came in, obviously a white woman, when I came into the business, and I'm part of that cohort where there were suddenly a lot of women in newsrooms.
Yes, tell me about that.
Well, and some people said, oh, we're not going to listen to women, and too bad. That doesn't change it. And you know what? If somebody says, oh, they're only getting the job because they're women or whatever, you cannot back down because somebody thinks that. Of course, change has to happen. And if that's the only criticism, too bad. And if people don't want, what happens now to people who don't listen to bosses, right? Like if you don't want to listen to a boss of color because they are a person of color, well, I'm sorry, that's just not acceptable. And we do have that's where institutions do have power, right? That's where institutions can step up and boss up and say, no, you can't do that.
I hope you're right, Anna Maria. I really hope that that's true. But you'll forgive me,
but you're not,
when I say that I'm not entirely hopeful.
No,
I don't know.
I respect the fact that you bring that up because of what you see and what is around you. I'm going to go to another question. This comes from Yuki Matsuno. This is an interesting twist on how we talk about this. How can your listeners, readers, and viewers help increase media and journalist diversity, equality, and inclusion? So what's the responsibility or the opportunity to force change amongst the audience?
I mean, one of the things that happened when we got metrics at the CBC, when we could see who was reading the story, you could tell that there was a shift in public interest. Mostly after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's the report came out, you could see this shift in how many people were reading the story. It's a small thing, but who you follow on Twitter, what types of articles you open and read, who you interact with. And I always say this, and it's not like just get an Indigenous friend and then you're cool, but like I have so many colleagues and literally all their friends are white journalists. And, I'm the only Indigenous person that they know, like on a personal level, aside from all the people they interview. And I mean, one step you can do at least is follow lots of loud, vocal Indigenous people on Twitter. And I've actually seen, there was a magazine conference that I hosted, and there was this woman there, and it was like, you could tell the magazine used to be like just totally like very white focused. And all of a sudden it was like filled with these incredible stories from BIPOC artists. And I was like, what happened? Like, how did you go from that? Because it was in a very short period of time too. It was like in a year. This was like, I think last year. And she said, I just started following like you, Alicia Elliott, like these people and this person. And I started building that analysis and realizing some of the issues. And I think it sounds like little, but I think it's actually pretty huge. If you're just following, a bunch of white journalists who are maybe incredible, but you have like, that's your scope of analysis and what's going on in the world, you're not going to learn. And reading those stories, for me, that's it sounds small, but for me, it can be huge, and it can be really mind altering or shape shifting.
Anybody else got a thought on that?
That's the answer for me.
Yeah.
I
think, I encourage people to diversify and really think about who are the voices. Like if you were working in media and your group photos before the pandemic didn't have people who looked like us, like that's a thing too, because then they're going to talk to you about different things that are going on, the foods that they're eating, the issues that they care about, what they're reading, right? Like a feed is not just also the faces and things that they're talking about. It's also just like, what are they reading and what are they commenting on the things that they're reading themselves? It's also about what isn't being reported, right? Because we also critique what other things are being reported all the time, and we talk about it. It's a big conversation. And then going back to the optimism, I mean, I'm really optimistic having seen what happened after Denise Balkasine took over Chatelaine, and how quickly, even what the imagery regarding the cover images, and then that changed everything, right? Because people were like, you know, it was like the stories, who they were commissioning, and then there was a huge ripple effect. There's also like who she staffed up, and she had built that network over a long time. You know, I had contributed a story not long after she started taking over the magazine, and then that changes a lot of what we think of as like women's journalism or Canadian journalism and the resources that were put in. But going back to what Angela was saying, I really think it's also just about people realizing the work involved in allyship is being, instead of being defensive, saying, I'm at a real position to learn and contribute in a meaningful way through my resources or my influence and who I amplify on Twitter, but also in terms of in my professional life. And I think that was the thing, is moving past, because quite often still we're encountering people who are still defensive, who say, oh, you know, like, who take it as a personal attack. And we're just saying, this is a moment in which you can be part of the change, because we can't do it alone. We need your resources and we need your position of power or influence. And to also talk to your friends why it's not okay, why, you know, you should be paying attention to the issues, why you should care about what's going on among Indigenous fishermen right now, or, you know, all these other issues, why you should maybe talk to your family members if they're saying racist things about the Black community, like all of that stuff. I think that's a way that is a conversation in media organizations, but also at large. And I think that's the real thing right now. But it's a long-term work thing, and it's a cumulative action. It can't just like it can't be like an Instagram photo and then you're done.
No, it's the ongoing work. Well, we're talking about real change here. We're talking about the need for it, and then real change requires ongoing care.
Yeah.
And attention.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're almost out of time. Anybody else? Who else wants to just jump in with a few more thoughts on what you're thinking right now?
One of the things I just wanted to say when it comes to leadership, and when Nanaba was talking about, you know, all these people might come in and then people are going to start questioning, you know, are you a diversity hire? That happens now, right? Yeah. That happens all the time now. I hear that from peers, and it's awful. And, you know, people got into this business for 100 years or so because they were white, because that was their network, because that's who they represented, right? That was where our standard was for so many years. And the other thing that I want to say about leadership, because I think it's a huge, important question, the discussions that people are having at the leadership level right now, is that you could be a diverse hire, you could be part Métis, but does that make you have a race analysis, or will that make you go to bat for that lone First Nations woman who's really struggling to have Indigenous voices heard and to not be erased and to not have her stories excused away and to be constantly being called biased because she's doing Indigenous stories? And so that's something I think is really, really going to be critical for the next level, is if we do see these cluster hires, the leadership needs to step in also and sit and be that voice and talk about, for, you know, 100 years or whatever, it's been, you got the job because you were white. Things are changing now. Our perspective is changing, and that needs to be a cultural shift, a paradigm shift within our entire newsrooms. And people need to also say, if you're going to be racist, you don't belong here. Go, bye, there's the door. Mm-hmm. That needs to be our cultural shift. And that's hard, because people are not going to like that, because people aren't used to that. So that's
absolute intolerance, absolute intolerance. We will not, like, it's just, I agree with that part. It's just not something that we deal with. If that's how you are, and if it happens in a certain way too many times, that's it. Because then it does, to me, you're not a good journalist. To me, if you are racist.
We're gonna have to end it right on that note. Thank you, all three of you, for what you've offered and what you shared today. It really matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna Maria.
And thanks to everybody for watching. Now, on September 28th, CJF's World News Day virtual event, we'd like you to join us for that. It's celebrating the power of journalism to affect change. It's hosted by CNN's Brian Stelter, and it's a webcast that will feature newsmakers such as Dr. Anthony Fauci, journalists such as Rappler's Maria Ressa. Visit worldnewsday.org to sign up and watch that webcast. It takes place at 7 o'clock Eastern on September 28th. Now, we've got upcoming J Talks again on this wider theme. On October 29th, we are talking about changing business models with Mitra Kalita, Senior Vice President of CNN's Digital Programming, and Rasmus Kleis-Nielsen, Head of Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. For updates, you can visit the website or sign up for the newsletter updates. And so we'll be seeing you next time. Thank you so much for watching and for sending in your questions and for this discussion. Bye for now.